Good afternoon and a warm welcome. What a tremendous pleasure it is to see all of you join us here at the Forum St. Peter for our Latin America Day 2023, our traditional annual flagship event. I'm very honored to officially welcome Ambassador Mirko Giulietti, head of the Americas Division at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, and Minister Hervé Lohr, Deputy Head of Bilateral Economic Relations and Head Americas at the State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, who will be on a panel together later. A warm welcome also to the Latin American ambassadors present, Excellencies Claudia Buzzi and Ana Gabriela Massi, Ms. Buzzi from Brazil and Ms. Massi from Costa Rica, Ambassador Frank Tressler from Chile, Ambassador Francisco Echeverri from Colombia, Ambassador Luis Alberto Castro from Peru, and Ambassador Alfredo Raggio from Uruguay, as well as Swiss ambassadors Gabriele De Righetti from Costa Rica and Paul Garnier from Peru. Thank you, Excellencies, for supporting us today. I'm also cordially welcoming all other diplomats representing Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and Paraguay. It is a great pleasure to see that the LATCAM board is represented today by Linda Walker, Andrea Covini, as well as our honorary ambassador, Dr. Philippe Nell. Wonderful to have you here. An event like this one would be difficult to organize by our chamber without the continuous and generous joint support of our patrons, Credit Suisse, Julius Baer, Neodent, Nestlé, Novartis, Roche, Swiss Re, UBS, Vontobel, Zurich Insurance, and our major sponsor, Switzerland Global Enterprise. We are extremely grateful to all of them. SGE, as you may know, is our cooperation partner year-round and has an important role in today's program as well. I'm delighted to welcome here, in particular, its CEO, Simone Wyss-Fedele, and its Head of Global Network, Thomas Fürst. A special additional thank you goes to our venue host, Credit Suisse, for having us at their state-of-the-art conference center and making sure that the smooth running of our program and all aspects of our well-being are looked after throughout the day and evening. Well-being, it is the foundation of happiness, and happiness is also the topic with which we want this conference to start. A couple of weeks ago, I was spending a weekend in the Bernese Alps, enjoying the breathtaking view from the Jungfraujoch over the Aletsch Glacier. On the train that brought me to the top of Europe, I had a conversation with a couple from California who happened to be originally from Taiwan. When they heard that I'm Swiss and that I live here, they said that we Swiss are supposedly the happiest people in the world because we inhabit such a beautiful, rich, and well-organized country. Yes, in Switzerland, no doubt, we have a lot to be grateful for and a lot to be happy about. But what are generally the criteria that lead us human beings to be happy and satisfied with our lives or not? More than 10 years ago, an international group of scholars around Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, Richard Laird at London School of Economics, and John Helliwell at Vancouver School of Economics started examining the well-being of nations, scrutinizing economic, political, and social aspects, interviewing hundreds of thousands of survey respondents all around the world. Then they published for the first time their findings in the World Happiness Report. This report, which is published annually, has since become an important piece of reference for governments, corporations, and NGOs. Now I'm thrilled to hand over to our dear friend and LATCAM Vice President, Linda Walker, who will talk to you about happiness in Latin America, as evaluated and explored in the World Happiness Report. Let's welcome Linda to the stage with a round of applause.
Welcome, everyone, also from my side. Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the Latin American Day from myself and the entire LATCAM board. Do you also think that it has become increasingly difficult to start any event or gathering on a positive note? For many years, we have been drawn in, dragged down by negative news from everywhere. War, refugees, migrants, climate change, natural catastrophes, corporate scandals, cybercrime, you name it. Regardless of the challenge, it is so important to concentrate on the good and to stay positive and resilient. Tatjana mentioned just now, some researchers have made their focus on positive aspects of the life a priority and created the World Happiness Report. Currently, the 4 happiest countries are Finland, Denmark, Iceland, and Israel. If you go back to 2017, Norway ranked first, followed by Denmark, Iceland, and Switzerland. Israel was ranked only 11th. Most of you probably are not surprised to see that there's a stable Nordic component among the top ranks, and that Switzerland, which dropped to place 8th in 2023, ranks among the top 10. Now we were curious to explore how Latin American countries fare in the report and how they coped after the setback they suffered from the COVID pandemic. Of a total of 137 surveyed countries in 2023, the report mentions Costa Rica as the happiest Latin American nation, holding the 23rd place. However, in 2017, Costa Rica was still ranked 12th. I'm showing you the slide now. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry about that. I'm showing you the slide to illustrate how those 18 Latin American countries rank that were taken into consideration in the survey. As you can see, Costa Rica is first, and I guess no one's surprised that Venezuela is in quite a low position right now. If you look at the period between 2002 and 2016, the largest increase in the average level of happiness of all countries was measured in Nicaragua, closely followed by Ecuador. I think we have someone here from Ecuador, from the Embassy of Ecuador. Chile, Uruguay, and Peru, all of them within the 12 first ranked. A fall of the level of happiness during this period could be observed in Panama, Costa Rica, Belize, and Venezuela. The 10 countries with the largest decline in the average life evaluations typically suffered some combination of economic, political, and social stresses. On the other hand, evidence has been provided since 2005 that good governance enables countries not only to sustain or improve the level of happiness, even in times of economic crisis, but also improve significantly the quality of life. What is the World Happiness Report really about? It explored 6 factors that determine the level of happiness in societies. These factors are seen as representative of the social foundation of well-being. First of all, GDP per capita in terms of purchasing power parity and based on data released by the World Bank. Social support for each individual, meaning if you are in trouble, you can count on the support by family and friends. Healthy life expectancy, including mental health that drives behavior and individual choices. This is based on data by the World Health Organization. Freedom to make life choices, meaning whether you are satisfied with the degree of freedom to choose how you want to live your life, and that includes, of course, human rights. Generosity, a key marker for a sense of positive community, engagement, and human connection, which can be active social, cultural, and charitable involvement. And last but not least, perception of corruption in government and in businesses. For questions about social support, freedom of choice, generosity, and corruption perception, the average of all binary answers, yes or no, per country was the benchmark. If you take a look at the happiness gap between the top 10 and top bottom countries in the overall survey, then 3/4 is accounted for by differences in these variables, with GDP per capita, social support, and healthy life expectancy as the largest contributors. I want to show you another slide where we chose randomly Brazil as the largest Latin American economy with its level of happiness shown in the interactive map. You can see on the map not only Brazil, but actually all of the Latin American countries display a yellow or green smiley indicating that the happiness score is fairly high or above average. Previous reports have argued that the strength of the underlying social fabric, as represented by levels of trust and institutional quality, affects a society's resilience in response to economic and social crisis. There is every hope that simply changing the focus from the material to the social foundations of happiness will improve the rate at which lives can be sustainably improved for all throughout the world and across generations. Next to the Global Competitiveness Report, many of you probably know it, published each year by IMED in Lausanne, which evaluates economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, and infrastructure based on hard statistics, surveys, and background data of some 600 countries. The World Happiness Report provides highly valuable and increasingly appreciated complementary insights. To conclude, I would like to read you a text. The content comes across quite general, but please bear with me. Here it is. Restrictions on social gatherings and physical distancing have disrupted the strong social connections and communal activities that contribute to happiness in Latin American societies. Lockdown measures, business closures, and job losses have resulted in economic hardships, leading to increased stress, anxiety, and a decline in happiness levels. Happiness acts as a buffer in difficult times, enabling individuals to cope with adversity, approach difficulties with a more optimistic outlook, and bounce back from setbacks more effectively. Solidarity and community support are deeply ingrained in Latin America's society. People often come together to help those in need, creating a sense of unity and shared responsibility. This communal spirit enhances cohesion and contributes to the overall happiness of the population. Over the past decades, Latin American countries have made significant strides in economic and social development. Increased access to education, healthcare, and basic services has contributed to improved quality of life. As nations in the region continue to invest in social welfare programs, poverty reduction, and inclusive growth, the overall well-being of their populations is positively impacted. Regarding differences between urban and rural societies, rural communities often rely more heavily on traditional practices, collective support, and communal ties, which can contribute to their resilience. Urban areas may exhibit higher levels of resilience due to access to resources, educational opportunities, and social networks. Now I can tell you that this text is 100% a product of ChatGPT. Tatjana made the experiment with ChatGPT, asking it to compare resilience, happiness, and coping mechanisms, especially during and after the pandemic in Latin American societies, especially if there were differences in urban and rural regions. That's the result which the algorithm produced in less than 1 minute. You may judge for yourself how coherent, accurate, and significant you think the information is that ChatGPT provided. But fact is that artificial intelligence is upon us, impacting our lives now. We will hear much more about it in the closing session. I hope that you will be happy and inspired by our program, and wish you a wonderful and productive program. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for introducing us to the World Happiness Report and the happiness of Latin American nations. As I mentioned it before, SGE is our main sponsor and cooperation partner. LATCAM is very privileged to be able to enjoy its support and valuable partnership. Moreover, we are proud to be considered by SGE part of Team Switzerland. I'm absolutely delighted to announce our next speaker, CEO of SGE, Simone Wyss-Fedele. Please give her a warm welcome.
Does it work? Yes. Estimados embajadores, queridos colegas, it's a true pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Tatjana, for your warm words. I could not be more delighted to be here. LATCAM for us is absolutely a key partner and a very long-standing key partner with whom we have achieved so much together. And I thank you for once more organizing this excellent event and for your collaboration. So thank you, Tatjana. Thank you, Linda, and thank you as well, Ramon Esteve. So it's a pleasure to be here for two reasons, right? On one hand, to honor LATCAM. I hope I've done so diligently. And on the other side, of course, it's probably the passion of many here in the room, right? To honor Latin America as a key region on this lovely world where you really can explore great business opportunities and encounter actually happy people. So, I mean, if you travel Latin America, I think there's some happiness there, right? So you can feel that. So we can say there's a high interest both from Latin American business partners and Swiss business partners to explore those business opportunities further. And it's a good time, right? We all know that Latin America has been strongly hit by the recent crisis, starting from the pandemic over the Russian-Ukraine war, etc. But it bounces back, as it always does, very fast. And there is a high need actually for technology that is actually explored in Switzerland, and for Swiss companies it's actually a great place to do business, and we will share a little bit why. So I did not have ChatGPT, but I had a great team supporting me in the speech, right? So first of all, let me talk a little bit about the team. So we know Latin America, it's a beauty, we agree, right? Yet, but for export starters, it can also be a little bit a diva, right? So it's really important that you find the right approach to enter the market, that you do have a good plan, really involving as well the culture, which is very different in between the different countries in Latin America, and that you really validate your partners well, right? Because in the end, you win together with them. So this is where we as SG, together with our partners, which you see here a little bit come in as one team. And what is it? So we as SG, with our Swiss business hubs, we're in Brazil, we're in Chile, and we're in Mexico in Latin America. However, we work together with LATCAM in Switzerland and with 14 chambers on the continent and all embassies and Swiss representatives on the continent. So very important, with whomever you speak from our side, we will ensure as one team we deliver you a strong service, right? So we do not try to, say, okay, this is what you do, this is what you should be doing, but we actually say, okay, what is the joint interest is to serve Swiss companies the best going to Latin America, and doing that actually with joint support and as well joint scouting, right? So what are the business opportunities evolving? And you see this in the best way when you're on the ground, right? And what is interesting for Swiss companies, we see here. Let me give you a few examples. So what we regularly do, that the 14 chambers last year in summer, Martina Wiedenhalter was there in the lead, so they joined us in Switzerland, and we talked actually about, okay, what are challenges they're having, what are our opportunities that they see, and how can we ensure a high quality support for Swiss SMEs abroad. On the other hand, with LATCAM, of course, we always scout for opportunities, and then we do webinars together, for example, on the green economy in Colombia. Or together with local chambers, we do a series of business scouting and then sharing that information in an early phase with country, back then with Paraguay and Uruguay and Panama on regional logistical clusters. So there are many ways how we can collaborate together, but important for me is that you get to know the team, right? And I think many of the teams are in fact here today. So it's great if later on when we have the apéro, right, you reach out, you have a discussion, and I think we can learn a lot from each other. Let's talk about Latin America, right? So I've highlighted, yes, the hit was strong. There was quite some inflation. There was quite some recession. There is quite some public debt. However, what we see is a strong rebound. And what you need to be aware if you do business in Latin America, instability is part of the game, right? So we do have some, I think, bigger companies here, and I remember when I was working for Novartis, we always sent young GMs to Latin America that they learn crisis, right? So I think this is just part of the game, but you can choose your attitude. You can say it's difficult, you can say, too risky, or you can say, wow, every crisis is an opportunity. So let's see what is the business potential that you can unleash in Latin America. Now, there are many opportunities, and if you count together, what you see here is the number of SMEs we supported in 22. If you count them together, right, it's one-to-one support, right? So it's over 400, right? So, North America is not that much more, right? So actually, all in all, that's big. And if we look, what's the opportunity, right? I should wear my glasses, then I could read this, but I can read that, okay? So there actually is quite some untapped export potential. Now, if we go back and look at the latest numbers, roughly it's between 6 and 7 billion if we look at Swiss exports to Latin America. There's 50% more potential, right? So there's something to do there. As we said, we believe, or we try to early on for different sectors to scout together with local partners for arising business opportunities. This is not in all details, it's rather early, and then being a teaser for you as a company to follow up fast with our local team to see what's in for yourself. Right now we have 115 projects. In there, it could be green hydro projects in Brazil, it could be a railway in Mexico, it can be different things, right? But go and have a look. We change them actually on a daily basis, right? So things that are no more up to date, they go out, new things are coming in. And doing like that already this year is interesting. We already supported 160 SMEs. Now, is this a lot, right? I wanted to share later, but I think here is a better match. If you look just in the beginning of the year, right? So it's roughly the same number as in 22, but actually those 160, when it's one-to-one support, we mean, you know, it's a tailored support for a specific company, not just the general information. This is 40% of companies coming to us and asking for support. We're actually looking at Latin America. So that's a very high interest. Now, it's not always easy. So what's the right approach? And many of you will know, however, based on our experience, yes, the entrance can be difficult, particularly if you think of Brazil, if you think on tariffs, right? That's not an easy one. But once you're in the market with the right support, there is actually quite some decent growth, right? So you just need to find out what's the right approach, what's the right partner for you to tackle actually this, let's say, border barriers to enter the market. Then within the market, yes, sometimes in Mexico it can be difficult to navigate. Maybe you're a little bit afraid, oh, where is the crime, right? But actually, you can manage those risks. And with the right partner, you know which region maybe is a little bit less risky, what is the behavior you can do, what you not do, and, you know, and how can you behave yourself in times of crisis. And this is what we want to say. There is a team that can advise you on your approach. I think this has to be a match, particularly if you're maybe a smaller SME or a startup. You can't try 100 times to enter the Latin American market. So rather get it first right. Entry barriers you need to address. You need to really understand the culture. This is a country where doing business goes over people, right? So I mean, you need to make an emotional connects, and you need to have the right partner. So this is important. There are some markets where corruption can be a little bit higher, or it's just a different way of behavior. But here you really need to have the right information. Now, I want you to be a little bit hungry about Latin America, okay? So let's do a little bit of deep dive. So maybe not all of you are aware that Latin America actually aspires and has a quite good chance to be a key player when it comes to clean energy. Germany, for example, plans that roughly 50% of their green energy supply will come from Brazil. Well, maybe our authorities should think a little bit about that too, right? I mean, they're aware, but it's interesting, right? Let's do a little bit of competition in between the countries. Now, where is this coming from and why? Think of Chile. Chile has the highest solar incidence. Think of Patagonia. There is a huge effort in wind generation. Think of Brazil, the northeast coast. You have many hours of sun, you have strong winds, and you have flat water. This is just perfect for green hydrogen. This is where the German engineers are going. Think of Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile together. They have 35% of the world supply of lithium. This is what you need to make e-batteries, right? So, and LATAM is preparing. They are aware of this strength, right? So just one example, Brazil until 2030 is going to spend 50 billions into clean energy. It's 130 solar farms, it's 70 green hydrogen projects. So there is something going on. And it's as well a call to action, actually, if you want to ride on this wave, you should get active now, right? I don't know how many waves there will be. So what can Swiss companies bring? They bring technologies to unleash this potential. Not everything is yet here. An example, it's very important, the standards for green hydrogen, where Swiss companies together with the EPFL are actually leading in developing those standards. Important example, transportation of green hydrogen, right? The second thing is, how can you convert solar, wind, biomass into green hydrogen? Then, of course, how can you transform hydrogen actually to energy through fuel cells? And last but not least, right, how do you develop engines that actually run with green, I hope so, hydrogen? So I hope you've gotten hungry. I show you a little bit more. Now, if we look at our demand side, right, so we support roughly 6,000 SMEs per year together with our partners. And what is very interesting when it comes to Latin America, we see a very high interest for Swiss SMEs when they look at entering into new markets, particularly Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, for the time being this year. And why? They need to diversify. Some countries like Russia, that's no longer a focus. China situation, it's difficult to many, let's see, Swiss companies that are in China, a majority continues to do good business in China, taking the necessary steps to tackle the risks and manage the opportunities. But you need to diversify. It's absolutely critical. And Latin America is very interesting for Swiss SMEs to diversify, and there's growth. And there's a very long-term relationship in between the countries. So actually Swiss companies, they feel good in Latin America. Swiss companies have rather yet difficulties in Africa, right? So it's riskier for them because they do not understand the culture as well. But there's actually quite a good cultural fit. And we have very good institutional networks with free trade agreements, I hope upcoming free trade agreements, and as well the Team Switzerland being in place. So in general, what is important, you see here, you see Hans, he's in Brazil, Marc in Chile, Ruben in Mexico, and as I've said, all those many partners, they're here to support, particularly of interest, export technicalities. That's always right, enter the market. It's as well matchmaking opportunities. So having actually partners and Swiss SMEs gathering, and of course, business partner search. These are services that are very much asked. Now, let me come to the most important things. I think it's always the team. So I think here a great photo of the team LATCAM and SG. And we do many things together, right? So I think Brazil Agritech is getting big, and together with LATCAM, we really tried to pick out relevant business opportunities for Switzerland and then to bring it out through webinars. With the chambers in Mexico, we tried to match with regards to railway projects. With the chamber in Argentina, of course, international payment terms are a little bit an issue, but one can support. And Peru is one example with the local chamber, as we're not in Peru, right? We do the Perumin. It's a Swiss, with a Swiss pavilion, right? Because it's actually a quite important fair. And in Brazil, some of you might know there's quite a big economic mission going now, beginning of July. And there's going to be focus on matchmaking and networking in the area of rail, energy, and sanitation. I hope very much we can come back with some successes. So having said that, in the end, it's always about having an excellent team, a great spirit and collaboration to unleash business opportunities. And so thank you again. If you do not know us already, so maybe those of SG, can you quickly raise the hand? Okay, great. Maybe some chambers? LATCAM, of course. Okay, so we as well have some chambers. Okay, excellent. Mexico, the new deputy, wonderful that you're here. So just reach out to us, talk to us, and we're actually very eager to get to know better what are the challenges you face, how can we support, and we're looking very much forward to that. Now, having said that, I'm wishing all of you a great afternoon, and for all of us, I think let's wish and let's wish for a very successful 23 and after. So thank you very much. Muchas gracias por su atención. Ya después, I would say. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Simone, for giving us an appreciation of the huge potential in Latin America and the support that SGE gives to SMEs. It is a true pleasure to have you here. Now, those of you that are not with us for the first time, you know that now's the moment when we throw the heavy stuff at you, the more complex things. This year's session on the economic and financial situation is an outlook for Latin America amid US recession fears. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome our next speaker. He's the head of global equity strategy at Credit Suisse. Welcome to the stage, Marc Häfliger.
So also a big thank you for having me. I mean, as you can see on the title, I'm heading the equity strategy team at Credit Suisse. I'm part of the Chief Investment Office. And the good thing or the benefit for you guys is you have a much better understanding of Latin America than I have. So I hope I can give you a bit the outsider view to the region and what we think are opportunities within this wonderful region. But I also included in the title US recession fears. And let me first set the, let's call it the economic backdrop, which I think is a very crucial one. I mean, last year, what we have observed is the highest inflation in 40 years. In very simple terms, it had three key drivers. Number one, the reopening after the pandemic, stimulated by a lot of fiscal stimulus. Secondly, we had very unfortunate events from the geopolitical side, which led to a spike in commodity prices, which is obviously also a key driver of inflation. And thirdly, we had supply chain issues, mainly driven also by continued lockdowns in the powerhouse or manufacturing powerhouse in China. So record high inflation in 40 years. And therefore, central banks across the globe, they were late in the game. Latin America has been the exception, but Western central banks, they have been late in the game. They, for a long time, talked about transitory inflation. They have been wrong, and therefore they have to tighten or had to tighten even more. So by now, the Federal Reserve in the US has hiked interest rates by more than 5%. So that's huge. And this brings me to this chart here. It's not our own model. It's a recession probability model from the New York Fed. And in very simple terms, it looks at the shape of the yield curve. Because if you ask an economist what's the best predictor of a recession, it's an inverted yield curve. And again, this at the moment is very inverted, i.e. the longer end of the yield curve is much lower than the short end of the yield curve, which means that market participants expect a severe slowdown. And therefore, again, yield curve is a good predictor for a recession. And based on this tool, we can see here clearly at the moment the probability that in the next 12 months we do face a US recession is at 70%. So that's a very elevated level. I mean, the question is then also how severe will it be? Will it be a technical recession or really a hard landing? I mean, this probably needs to be seen. But overall, I think we all agree there are, let's call it, challenging times ahead of us. So how do we assess at the moment the situation for Latin America? And I'm again honest with you, we did focus a bit more on the major regions, which is Brazil and Mexico, also in terms of GDP. So therefore, the next couple of slides will a bit more about the big picture. But also at the end of the presentation, I will give you a bit of a broader summary of Latin America and how we assess opportunities. The first one, again, I said before, the US Fed was a bit too late to tighten inflation. And this can actually not be said about Brazil and Mexico. So Brazil and Mexico, they already started to hike interest rates in 2021. And therefore, the good news is that they were, for once, I probably would say, a bit ahead of the game. Because another issue is probably also that Latin America is probably more used to inflation, while we in the Western world are, to be honest, not used to inflation anymore as we have seen it last year. I mean, in Switzerland, people are crying when we have 3% inflation. I think 3% is a level some economies would wish to have 3% inflation. Anyway, that's a different topic. The point I wanted to make here is, the good news is, as inflation, and that's the blue bars in this chart here, and you can also see the upper bound, lower bound, and target rate, you can clearly see we have a trend of disinflation in Brazil. And as you probably know, the Selic rate is already at 13.75%, so always 14% of interest rates. And we think this disinflation now opens the room for the Brazilian central banks to cut interest rates. We already expect a number of interest rate cuts this year, for example, already in August. But then also next year, we expect aggressive rate cuts by the Brazilian central banks, bringing the target rate back to 9%. And you could argue this is good news because that should stimulate growth, should stimulate investments. Secondly, what is a bit the issue with Brazil is their debt to GDP ratio. Again, it's a busy chart, a lot of information, but on the far right-hand side, you can see the debt to GDP in 2021, 2022, 2023, and the projections for 2028. And you can clearly see that bar is rising quickly in Brazil. That's not good news. Only China is expected to be in an even worse position in 2028. So therefore, again, as an outsider, I think for me, or as an investment specialist, it's very important that Brazil is able to tackle that issue. Obviously, with this new fiscal reform, the Brazilian government tries to tackle it. They now linking spending to revenues, which I would say is good news because it's a bit more controlled. But let's be honest, at the end of the day, they need to deliver if they really are that strict as they plan to. But overall, I think when you ask me what is the biggest issue for Brazil at the moment, it's indeed the debt situation. While at the same time, Mexico, but also some of the other Latin American countries, they are at the moment in, let's say, in okay shape. In particular, Mexico has done a decent job in order to have relative restrictive spending, i.e. they have not increased debt that much as, for example, Brazil. But I think in Brazil, that's a very important topic. And also when you look at latest market developments, there was the discussion now in the lower house in Brazil. It has been passed. It goes now to the upper house. And market in general take that positively if that fiscal reform goes through. But again, they definitely need to bring the evidence that they are able to deliver. So what about Mexico? While Brazil is obviously a bit more related to what's happening in the commodity market, what's happening in China, Mexico is clearly very closely linked to the US economy. So therefore, it depends a lot what's happening in the US, and a couple of charts also here on the Mexican economy. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you can again see that inflation is coming back. Again, that's good news. The core inflation, that's the blue line, is coming back a bit slower, also because of services that are still picking up, while headline is coming down a bit quicker, also as commodity prices declined. But overall, the point I wanted to make with this chart here, it's also Mexico that can start to cut interest rates very soon. And therefore, also from an economic outlook, that should be quite good news. And the other chart I wanted to show is about investments into Mexico. And when I talk about investments into Mexico, one big topic, I would say, and a big opportunity, and again, you have much more information and experience than I have, but I think the topic of nearshoring is an opportunity, for example, for Mexico. Why? Number one, it's regional proximity. I mean, it's obviously very close to the US. Secondly, we have still a very supportive demographics. We have a good and well-educated labor force in Mexico. Thirdly, we have, and that is shown on the right-hand side, when you look at the average monthly earnings. I mean, as an entrepreneur, you still have to argue, hey, I get very well-educated people and workers in Mexico, but if you look at the costs I mean, the trade-off is quite decent. I mean, you can clearly see that wages are still relatively low in Mexico. And fourthly, what also helps the nearshoring topic in Mexico is some of the trade agreements, such as USMCA, and obviously, I mean, in particular, this one together with Canada and the US. But overall, to summarize, nearshoring, or some call it friendshoring, because this nearshoring is mainly happening in countries which you have similar values, in particular in this case in the US. And as you can also clearly see, that's on the right-hand side regarding this chart here, or the left-hand side, you can see that the share of US imports, the yellow line shows China, clearly declining quite significantly. And we know all the things are going on between the US and China. And at the same time, the import share, US import share of Mexico has clearly started to pick up. And I would expect that this trend will continue. Brazil, again, is probably somewhere in the middle, because the US, compared to Mexico, is probably not such an important trading partner, for example, compared to China or other commodity importing nations. Sorry, before I come back to this one, and again, that's probably also room for a discussion. I see this as a big opportunity, again, as an outsider with an objective view on the region. But I think also Mexico needs to do its homework. It's about political stability. It's about investments into infrastructure, and I think we have a slot where we talk about infrastructure, about technology, also some of the political decisions, for example, with the airport in Mexico City, which has been cancelled. I mean, all this is probably not great to support that opportunity. But overall, the statement I want to make, or we want to make from our side, is this is clearly, in our eyes, an opportunity for Latin America as a whole, but in particular, Mexico. Then let's talk briefly about investments, about financial markets. This chart is the one we would show to clients when we talk about fixed income investments in Latin America. It's a very simple chart. It shows you the real yields. So it's nothing else than when you look at the yields you are getting minus the inflation. And this is at the moment at very elevated levels in Brazil. So that's the blue line, so almost 10%, but also in Mexico, because yields are still high, inflation is coming back, i.e. The residual is picking up. But also here I have to say, I think there's still a case to be made for those investments, but let's not forget, over the last couple of months, we have seen already a huge rally, so a huge performance in those assets. I mean, on top of that, my colleagues, which are a bit more on the fixed income side, they tell me fantastic returns, in particular in US dollar, because also the currency has strengthened. But the one market they mention most of the time is Colombia. I mean, Colombia seems to be up like 25% in the last 3 months, which again is the Colombian peso plus the performance of the local currency bonds. But again, I would still make the case it's a decent investment opportunity. Then again, I'm heading the equity strategy team, and I like to work with macroeconomic factors when I analyze regions. And in very simple terms, one of the key factors when you are assessing Latin American equities, again, the heavyweight is Brazil, it's commodities. So if you are constructive on commodities, you probably should be increasing your exposure to that region. If you're bearish about commodities, probably it's not the best idea. And also we have done a similar exercise, so I do know there's a good fit when you look at the performance of Latin America and commodities, but also if you look at GDP, you can see there is at least some fit. And what I also believe is quite interesting, the yellow line is the year-over-year GDP growth in Mexico, and you can clearly see that commodity is not that important as, for example, as for Brazil. And obviously for Mexico, again, what I mentioned before, it's more about what's happening to the US economy. But in Brazil, in the case of Brazil, the development of commodity prices, and again, the gray bars show the change in the Bloomberg Commodity Index. There is a decent fit between Brazilian GDP and the commodity developments. Also very briefly, I'm sure that also most of you are aware of, But Latin America, if you just purely look at the market capitalization basis, I have to say it's nowadays a rather small region, unfortunately. And when you look at the sector composition, again, due to the fact that Brazil is the heavyweight, it's a very cyclical, or we call it a value region. So, for example, on the left-hand side, MSCI Latin America, huge exposure to financials, materials, and some stables. Sorry. And very little exposure to IT. And when you look at the two heavyweights, again, Mexico is indeed a bit more of a defensive market. It has huge exposure to staples, to communication services. I mean, American Mobile is obviously more on the communication services. Walmart, FEMSA are more on the staple side. But this is rather a defensive market. And again, on the right-hand side, Brazil is obviously a bit the high octane. So it's a very cyclical market. And it's one who is very geared to energy, materials, and the biggest sector is financials. Very briefly also on valuation. The fact at the moment about Brazilian equities is that if you purely look at valuation, and when we talk valuation, we look at something simple like the price to earnings ratio. So how much you pay for the earnings in simple terms. And the blue line shows you the absolute level of the price to earnings ratio in Brazil, while the blue line is the average. So the absolute level is clearly below the long-term average. And the yellow line shows you the discount to emerging markets. So at the moment, Brazilian equities, they are trading at a 40% discount to emerging markets, which is even below the long-term discount of around 15%. So overall, we see at the moment relatively appealing valuation levels in Brazilian equities. But again, it's a cyclical market. If we see a severe global recession, this could then become a potential issue for that cyclical region. And then last but not least on the equity side, what we call risk premia. So it's the comparison between the earnings yield you're getting in the equity space minus the bond yield. And also this shows you at the moment that you get a relatively good compensation compared to the past in Brazil. Okay, now I'm becoming a bit more political, and probably that's also what you or the most of the crowd is a bit more interested into before I come to the opportunities and risks. I mean, we have seen more lately a lot of headlines about Latin America. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, for example, said that they have neglected that region, and this has been a mistake. We saw huge investments into Latin America again. On the bottom left-hand side, Tesla at the moment is looking for a plant in Mexico. But also the relation between China and Brazil is obviously also one that is in focus. So you can see the global economy or global politics, if you want to put it this way, have a big interest in Latin America. And we heard there are a lot of good reasons, for example, green energy, nearshoring, and others, commodities in general. And that's perhaps a bit, again, from my side as an outsider, where I think what could be a difficult decision to be made, and honestly, Switzerland is in the same position, is at one stage, perhaps they have to take sides. Is it China or the West? Or, yeah, the East or the West? And I have to say that's more my Swiss glasses on. Obviously, Switzerland is in a similar difficult spot. But overall, there is no doubt there is a big interest in Latin America. Big interest in Latin America means big opportunities. And let me come then to the last slide, and I think I'm still in time. So what are the opportunities as happy people? Let's start with first the good things. I mean, what are opportunities? I mean, I know it's perhaps a bit simplified, but also on the analysis we do, obviously, if commodity prices are developing in the right direction or to a higher level, that's a good thing for the region, for Latin America. So it could benefit from, let's call it, a commodity boom. And also the green transition, as we heard before, is also something that can and will benefit Latin America. Then, as I mentioned before, nearshoring, I opened the brackets and mentioned here Mexico. Again, we can debate. There are probably also other regions and countries, but from our angle, top of the list that could benefit from those developments, it's probably Mexico. Then what is an opportunity is if the region is able to achieve stability in terms of their policies and also in terms of their fiscal spending. I think that's a very crucial element. And this one, and also we heard it from previous speakers, we do know there's a lot of political, let's call it instability, or let's call it uncertainty in Latin America. But again, for me, as the outsider, I have to say, in relative terms, Latin America has been improving. And that's not so much because the region has done much better, but unfortunately the rest of the world has done much worse. So therefore, I think this improvement in political stability could be a huge opportunity for Latin America. And then last but not least, I mean, there are still a huge number of reforms in the different countries which are in the making, be it labor reforms or reforms to incentivize investments. And that's obviously also, by the way, something I forgot to tell about the risk of nearshoring, or what Mexico could potentially miss or miss the nearshoring boom is they so far have not talked about incentives, be it on subsidizing or on taxes when outsiders invest into Mexico. So that's also something which I would put into the reform bucket. So to make sure that investments from companies across the globe became more appealing. I mean, what are the risks for the regions? Again, probably very simplified, but obviously a severe economic recession, in particular in the US. I mean, this definitely would have a huge impact also on Latin America. The whole development at the moment, let's call it protectionism, or let's call it deglobalization, is in general probably also not the best news for Latin America as a region. Then a bit more a macro-related thing is if you have very strong US dollar, very elevated yields and inflation, this is in general also a risk for Latin America. I mentioned it before, if good or high commodity prices is good news, then obviously low commodity prices is bad news. And then also we face, or we have a presidential election in Mexico next year, and as always with elections, could lead to some changes and probably again forms of political instability. So to sum up, so again, this is a bit the outsider's view on this very interesting region. I think Latin America has a huge number of opportunities, but also they, in my humble opinion, they need to deliver of some of the points to make sure that they can benefit from those opportunities. So that's already it. I think that's well bang in time. So I think we have 5 minutes for Q&A, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So are there any questions I can help with? And please don't ask about UBS Credit Suisse. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Gaspar Velasco from the Embassy of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I thank you very much for the invitation, and information is very useful and very interesting. Actually, I think it's very, very professional. My first time in this forum, and I feel honored to participate. Actually, I'm not a question. It's just a simple comment. It's very clear, the picture of the opportunities and risk. But me as a Mexican, I would be more concerned about the elections in the US than the elections in Mexico.
Okay.
So
Okay.
This is the simple comment and the simple.
Yes.
Thank you very much for everybody.
That's a very fair point. Yeah, I should have added this one, right? Right. Okay. My bad. I completely agree. Yes. Could also have some impact on the region. I completely agree. Yes. Yes.
Maybe you can tell us what you think is going to happen.
In the US election?
In the US.
Ooh, no. I read somewhere it's recorded, so better not. I'm the Swiss guy. I'm neutral. Yeah.
No? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Karimi, and I'm Brazilian, and I'm living here in Switzerland for almost 12 years now. And I'm seeing the changes on the fiscal side in Brazil with optimism. And you said so in your presentation too. But there is a lot of questions there that I hear from my contacts in Brazil. my fellow Brazilians, that they fear that the package is not fair enough. I kind of think that is actually a very good thing because it's simplifying the system, and I believe that helps against corruption. So I think that's good news, but they think differently. So do you have any additional comment in saying why exactly do you see from the package that is being put together, what are the things that you see that are really consistent for and maybe reason for optimism?
So yes, thank you for that question. So yeah, it's a micro, so everyone, I don't have to repeat it, right? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, first of all, our colleagues in Brazil, our local guys, they are also much more skeptical, I have to say. I don't know, perhaps just in the nature of it, but first of all, I'm not saying that that solves all the problem, but as an outsider I think it's better than the previous system because before they just did what they wanted to do. I think there was a law that it shouldn't be above inflation or something like this, but they never kind of hold accountable for that. So they just kind of did what they did. And now at least you have a framework. You have a framework. I think it's maximum 70% of last year's revenues can be spent additionally. So you have a framework. So I think for me, again, as an outsider, this is good news. And also, if they do not achieve it, if they don't achieve the targets in terms of their primary surplus or deficit, this is reduced to 50% of additional revenues. So in a nutshell, A, they have a framework, and B, they have an incentive to increase revenues. Again, bad case could be is that they simply raise taxes, again, which is obviously then bad for investments. But the point I wanted to make with this reform, I think it's an improvement. But if they really stick to it and if they deliver, I don't know. But the fact that we have a new framework is good news. That's what I wanted to say. And also that they had to do something. So yeah. So I think we will find out. But your point about people locally being a bit more skeptical, I made the same experience, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm the ambassador of Uruguay. One risk I will add to the list of risks is inequality in Latin American societies. So I would like you to comment not only Brazil and Mexico. What do you think of the political stability of Latin American countries? Because this inequality have made mass protests from the populations, and the politicians try to bring down the governments. The opposition tried to bring down the governments with vote of no confidence, etc. So do you think that this inequality and this political instability in Latin American countries, does it affect investment? Or is there a decoupling from the businessman and the investment regarding the political instability in Latin American countries?
Also a very good point, and you're right, I should have added that. But I think in my own defense, I would also argue this inequality is probably not only a Latin American issue. I mean, to be honest, we have the same in the US. We have the same, in parts of Europe. Probably much more in other regions of the world. But this inequality, yes, I also argue that that's an issue and that's a risk. And much more, and again, we have company representatives in that audience, but this inequality is also probably for an entrepreneur an issue, but what is the clear issue is political instability. This is the issue for the guy who makes the investments. So therefore, I clearly see this instability from a political side, which could again be triggered by inequality on income, for example. This could be the trigger. But I think the bigger issue or the main factor is indeed this political uncertainty or instability, which is in focus for investors. Yeah. But I clearly see this as a risk as well. But I would also add that it's probably almost like a global phenomenon that we have to tackle. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, is it working? Yeah. Hi, here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, thank you.
I'm Letizia from the University of St. Gallen, and I have two questions. The first one is about your graph about the debt to GDP ratio. And I mean, most of rich countries have a way worse debt to GDP ratio than Brazil.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So my question is, and actually, this discourse coming from Switzerland has a huge impact on how Brazil deal with the provision of public services, because we are always discussing we cannot spend too much because international investors are too scared of Brazil because of this debt to GDP ratio. So my question would be, how risky is this risk, really? And my second question is about when you mentioned in the end that Latin Americans should choose one point between the West and China. And I mean, in Switzerland, with all the neutrality aspect, I don't really understand why Latin Americans should choose an economic partner between the West and China.
Okay, perhaps let me tackle the second question first. I hope I was not saying that they should, but I fear they kind of have to. Does that make sense? I'm not the guy telling Latin America has to choose sides, but what I can imagine will happen is US saying, for example, okay, we invest into Mexico, but you should reduce your deals with China. That's kind of what I want to say. So I could see potentially a risk that they have to decide. I'm not saying they have to decide, if that makes sense. But I see that geopolitical developments as a risk or could become an issue. On your first question, I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, Japan has a debt to GDP of above 200%. I think there are two issues or two reasons why I still flag this chart here. It's about the delta. Because when you look at this, Brazil is at the moment, or has been at 70%, and it's projected to be at 100%. So that's a huge increase. And secondly, in particular in the case of Japan, that debt is mainly held by locals. So they are kind of indebted to their own people, which makes things a bit easier, so to speak. While in Brazil, I don't have the exact ratio on top of my mind, but obviously you have foreign investors and you want to increase the investments from abroad into the country. So this is a bit the reason that number one, I think it's not so much about the level, but about the change in debt to GDP. And secondly, it's also about who owns the debt at the end of the day. But I completely agree. I mean, debt to GDP is also an issue in Europe. Not so much here in Switzerland, but in Europe in general. Japan, as we discussed before, but in particular in Japan, the good thing is about the debt is owned by the Japanese people. So it's a bit of one thing they can solve internally, if that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Marc, for your comprehensive assessment of the opportunities and risks from a financial point of view. The next session already has a long tradition in this event because the panelists are experienced high officials who each year assess the relations between Switzerland and Latin America from a slightly different angle. In this year's program, they will look at the Swiss contribution to Latin America on the road to sustainable growth. Please give a warm applause to Ambassador Mirko Giulietti from the FDFA, Minister Hervé Lohr from the SECO, and our Honorary Ambassador Dr. Philippe Nell, who will moderate the panel discussion.
Well, you're all set, huh?
I'm very pleased to welcome again this year Ambassador Mirko Giulietti and Minister Hervé Lohr to discuss for the next hour an important topic. The topic is linked to sustainability. And you noticed that Simone, Wyss-Fedele, in her presentation, gave a strong accent on sustainability, talking about lithium, talking about hydropower, talking about wind energy, talking about hydrogen, talking about new competitive advantage for Latin America. And we did not, coordinate anything, but it just happens that we are putting the focus on exactly the same thing for Latin America. And I just happened to have read a little while ago, just before we prepared this panel, a last report of the World Bank on Latin America. And in that report, you have a clear sentence saying that Latin America has a new comparative advantage today, and that advantage is precisely in sun, in wind, hydro, and natural capital, what they call natural capital. So here we are really focusing on something extremely important for the future of Latin America, and also for Swiss business, because Swiss business, Swiss technology, Swiss research, EPFL, and so on, are working very, very much into these specific areas, and a lot of startups moving up into these fields. So we will have our discussion in two parts. The first one, sustainability foreign policy, and the second one, trade and investment, for the first part. And then we will look at some Swiss programs in Latin America with a focus on sustainability. So let me start right away now with you, Mirko, for the first part. We are getting to the end of a 4-year legislature in Switzerland, election in the parliament in October, Federal Council in December, and adopting its present strategy on international cooperation, the Federal Council said, I quote, global sustainable development and poverty reduction are essential for a stable international order and are therefore also in Switzerland's interest. So again, we have sustainability and a link with poverty reduction. Now, my first question to you, in your opinion, why is sustainability so important for Swiss foreign policy? And how do you see the link with poverty?
First of all, good afternoon to everyone. And let me thank LATCAM for inviting me this year once again. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Philippe, and to exchange with my friend Hervé. Buenas tardes a los colegas de las embajadas en Berna y unos colegas que reconozco de Suiza, en Perú y en Costa Rica. Let me say at the outset that sustainability is important for our foreign policy, as you mentioned, but it's important for Switzerland. Sustainability, along with freedom, rule of law, equality of opportunity, is one of the principles enshrined in our constitution. So from the very beginning, we are talking about sustainability, both for domestic policy as well as foreign policy. And the concept on which we based our sustainability, or the definition which we based our stability concept, is the one from the Brundtland Commission of 1987 in the famous report, Our Common World, which defines sustainable development as the development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we have limits in this, we have present, and you have the future. The Swiss government has many strategies. It's not a word they lack a lot, but anyway, we have strategies. One of these strategies is the 2030 Sustainable Development Strategy, which gives us, both domestically and in foreign policy terms, some guidelines and some goals that we have to reach. And the government has, just to give you the idea of domestic and foreign policy, has 2 delegates for this sustainability. One at the Federal Department of Environment, Transport and Communication, and the second one at the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Then, in terms of foreign policy, we have our 4 years foreign policy strategy, which is one of the 4 priorities is sustainability. We have peace and human rights. We have prosperity. We have sustainability, and the 4th one is digitalization. So you see, it's extremely important. And even, and I talk here for SECO, in the foreign economy policy strategy, one of the objectives is to contribute to the economic environmental sustainability. And just to be sure, you mentioned the international cooperation strategy. The international cooperation strategy mentions the Agenda 2030 many times. It's not based on that, but it's a kind of our north. We are going on the same direction, as well as the United Nations, or the world. So we have this as my boss, Federal Council, Ignazio Cassis, used to say, foreign policy is domestic policy. So you see, we have this link to be coherent, both internally as well as in our foreign policy. This is just to give the general framework in which we're working.
Okay, no, thank you very much. It's very useful to have a general framework. And from that general framework, from the Swiss situation, let's look now at the Latin American situation. And in your view, sustainability is important for Latin America, but what are the major constraints, difficulties for Latin America really to move that agenda forward?
Let me say 2 things. I very much agree with the CEO of Switzerland Global Enterprise, the potential in Latin America for sustainability. Just to give you some data, 80% of the world population, they do live in Latin America. Latin America contributes only with 3.5% in the global GDP. So there's a lot of potential, let's say. 5% in the international trade. But 30% of biodiversity is in Latin America. 25% of nickel, copper, lithium, oil reserves, the lithium even more than 25% are in Latin America. The question is how Latin America, the government, private sector, academy, civil society, how do they manage this potential? It's up in their hands to manage it well. If they do manage it well, it will be a huge contribution to economic and environmental sustainability. If they don't, it will be a catastrophe. How they manage the mining of these resources, how they manage the sale of these resources, so far so on. So the potential is huge, and they do have in the governance, they do have quite a lot of responsibility to do it well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, very, very good. And indeed, no, it's a big challenge. It's a challenge for the whole world, because the whole world is going to need these resources, such as lithium, and also decarbonize energy and decarbonize production processes. Now, how do you see international organizations also contributing to cooperate and to bring forward this agenda, this important agenda that Latin America has for the whole world?
No. Maybe you mentioned also the constraints. If I do really very quickly, the major constraint that I see in Latin America, as in many parts of the world, is the difference of the political calendar. Let's say we have every 4 years or 6 years, depends on the country's elections, and the fact that you should apply the 7th generation principle from the Native Americans. 7 generations principle is very simple. They say you have to think, act, and work, thinking of the next 7 generations after you, and remembering the 7 generations before you. In other words, they also say, we do not inherit Earth from our predecessors. We borrow the Earth from the future generation. So this is the link for a politician in Latin America. Many times they only have 4 or 5, maximum 6 years of presidency. It's very difficult to think after 7 generations. And this is maybe the major constraint that I see. The different calendar in the sustainability is a very long-term calendar, and the political calendar in most of the Latin American countries is a very short one. So this is maybe the major constraint that I see.
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is very relevant what you say, and it doesn't apply only to Latin America.
Yeah,
all across the world, there is a political agenda, political calendar, there are elections, and therefore priorities usually are quite often set in order to reach maximum result within a certain time. But as you say very correctly, we should really put into the frame of everybody on this planet this seventh generation, because this is what's going to count at the end of the day. And we see it with climate change right now. Finally, very shortly, my last question very shortly, Switzerland now is chairing the UN Security Council. And do you see there in that function also the opportunity to have an impact on sustainability?
Yeah, this is a very, very much debated question. One of the priorities that we have at the Security Council is the effect of climate change on security. So it's very much debated. Some countries, members of the Security Council, that would prefer not to talk about it. They think that it's not a security issue. We think that it is. When you have drought, when you have lack of water, when you have hurricanes, people are moving. And moving millions or let's say thousands of people suddenly, it can cause quite a big crisis. The link with security, many countries, Security Council, they see security in, let's say, in military terms and not in very long terms, and disruption of population, sudden movement of population. So it's a debate which has begun many years ago. Other countries have put this point into the agenda. We are trying to do it also this year with some allies, but it's a difficult question.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a very good point, and we very much hope that Switzerland can come through in putting this point on the agenda and moving forward at the UN. It will be a great contribution for the Swiss presidency. Now, let me turn to Hervé. You're still here. Great, fantastic. Now we're going to go to economics, to trade, to investment. These are your topics at SECO. Advanced economies have returned to their forecasted pre-pandemic growth trajectory last year. Emerging economies would be back on that path by 2025. Now, following robust growth in 2021, the pace declined a little last year in Latin America, and forecasts are quite modest for this year. And let us look at what this means for Swiss business under the dimension of sustainability. First, I would like your assessment, because last year, Swiss exports to Latin America did very well. It was like plus 13%. And I checked this morning, no, it was plus 12. And for the first 5 months of this year, it is plus 13%, while it's growing only 0.5% to all the world. So much faster to Latin America. So you see the great job that Simone is doing with her team. It's really moving. Now, how do you see that, this great performance with Latin America last year and it's going on this year?
So first of all, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Philippe, for the question and trying to bring some facts and figures to this discussion. As you know, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are our biggest market, obviously, in Latin America, and they're receiving the most of Swiss exports throughout time. Export to Brazil came up, for example, at 2.4 billion Swiss franc last year. In terms of recovery, Costa Rica, Argentina, and Ecuador have ranked best, each of which increased the receipt of Swiss exports by 17.5% compared to 2021. As mentioned, Latin America has reached a recovery, you mentioned it, of 11.8%, my number, in terms of Swiss export in 2022. This number falls behind the 34% increase in Swiss exports to Southeast Asia, or even the leading 58% increase to the Middle East. Latin America recovery was stronger than that, nevertheless, of the United States and African countries. This said, Swiss exports to Latin America have been going exceptionally well in the first quarter of this year. Its growth rate of 18.8% compared to the same time period last year can only be topped by Northeast and Central Asia, 54.3%, and Central Eastern Europe, 22.2%. Other regions that have previously dominated Latin American recovery in 2022 have fallen off in the first quarter of this year. It is also important to note that Latin America countries have significantly increased their imports in 2021 and 2022 respectively. For 2022, the LAC region has indicated an increase of 24% in imports. So all in all, the increase in Swiss exports to Latin American countries comes hand in hand with an increase of global imports into Latin America almost parallelly, totally.
Okay, so very good. So we are fully in the trend here. And as we all know, Switzerland exports mainly to Latin America pharmaceuticals and machines and instruments and also watches. If we talk about machines, for instance, into instruments, there is a component on sustainability in what we export. If you got some specific cases, examples of products that we would export to Latin America in these areas?
Well, there is a couple of sectors where we are extremely strong. I think you named it. Agri-tech is one of the sectors where we definitely have to be more present. Drones, machinery, spreading water option. There is a lot to do in the medtech sector. There are certain countries in Latin America that are hubs to this. For example, Costa Rica is a very good example. There is certainly clean tech solutions. We've been discussing right now sustainability and the Swiss SMEs, the tissues we have with all the universities and the polytechnical school here in Zurich and in Lausanne. They have startups that are extremely competent and extremely competitive also in the world market. And I think when we discuss sustainability and we discuss biodiversity is extremely important in Latin America. That goes all in hand extremely well with the possibilities that are offered to Swiss solution for the continent, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, there is a great potential on the clean tech from Switzerland. And last year, SGE published 2 reports, one on Argentina and one on Peru, on business opportunities in the clean tech sectors. And this was done jointly with the Chamber of Commerce of Peru and Argentina, whose directors are right here in the room today. And if you look at these reports, wow, you find a list of companies and so on, great potential. And then not only for these 2 countries, but also for other countries. Now going to investment. Investment is very important element into the relationship between Switzerland and Latin America. What do you see in terms of evolution in the Swiss foreign investment to Latin America?
Right, so in 2021, there was a total of around 30 billion of Swiss foreign direct investment in Latin America. This number stands as a decrease of 9% compared to the year before. Meanwhile, the Swiss companies in Latin America employed around 186,000 people. The number is at the highest it has ever been for the region, and I think this is quite meaningful. You don't have to look only at the investment in absolute terms, but you have to look at the jobs and the companies that are investing and the presence and the production chain, etc., and the supply chain, it was mentioned. When comparing the Latin American case with Swiss foreign investment to Asia, we can observe that the Latin American region has experienced a slight decrease in FDIs already in 2019, previous to the pandemic. Meanwhile, investment in Asia went on to increase 22% in 2020. So it can be concluded that the Asian market has been able to significantly gain from the pandemic in terms of Swiss investment, while Latin America has fallen below its pre-pandemic numbers. However, as mentioned, employment in Latin America by Swiss companies has remained high even during the pandemic. Meanwhile, Swiss employment in Asia has been decreasing during the same time.
Oh, very interesting. So there is an increase in investment, but decrease in employment. But this sometimes is also linked to the data, the data which is being kind of produced together. But I think the an important criterion here is the jobs, the jobs created. And indeed, Swiss companies create great jobs in Latin America, all across, and also transfer technology, which enables the countries to move forward in quite a number of areas. In terms of the sustainability dimension of our investments, have you seen in your experience something particular to note?
No, what I see mainly is basically two things. When we did the first missions after the pandemic, is definitely that the sustainability agenda is getting more and more traction, even in Latin America. I had the feeling a couple of years ago, Latin America was not so keen in the discussion over sustainable development. It is now the case. We just came back from a mission in Panama, and it was quite interesting to hear the Panama Authority of the canal saying that basically their most strategic concern is the amount of water, of sweet water they will get in the future to operate the canal. So you could imagine the number of cargo that is going daily over the canal. That's about 12 Panamex huge ships. And if you don't have the canal operating, then you have a problem between Southeast Asia and North America and Europe, basically. And it's not going to be solved anytime soon by a canal SECO. So all this issue about sustainability is coming and becoming. We were in Argentina in November and December, and we were along the Paraná River, and we were visiting big mills, soya mills, and they were basically saying that their great concern is la sequía. And that the productivity at times where you have war in Ukraine is going to be quite an issue now. So that's the kind of things that you slowly hear more and more. We are in a year where you have El Niño. In Peru, it's certainly a topic also. There are projects about how you get water to Lima for the people, etc. That's the kind of things that slowly are emerging. And I think that our economy, is providing here absolutely top-notch technology. And I see also in the different multinationals, when you're visiting on the spots, that through the way you're processing things, waste management, etc., plastic, etc., that people are getting more and more into the thinking about circular economy, how to, and it has a cost, it has a cost on the end of the day. So you have to make the right choice here. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me now turn back to Mirko for the second part of our discussion this afternoon, referring to Swiss sustainability programs in Latin America. And Switzerland has a strong presence promoting its basic values of peace, democracy, and sustainable development, as you already mentioned a few minutes ago. And now, based on that, the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs has established joint political commissions with a number of countries in Latin America. And to which extent do you also integrate sustainability in those political discussions?
Sustainability as such is let's say, a standalone point. We don't, but we integrate sustainability in the other aspects that we were discussing with the different governments. Could be in the economic dimension to discuss, although even if it's the responsibility of SECO, we got some instructions and we talk about economic sustainability. Sure, we are talking about the negotiation in the framework of the global, the climate change discussions worldwide. There is always a topic on these specific points. We discuss sustainability also in the framework of our human rights discussions. Sustainability is, as you know, there are three pillars: the economic, the environmental, and the social one. We have to consider the social one, and social one is also human rights. There are many aspects. But we try to, without mentioning sustainability as such as a topic, it's a kind of a thematic that is discussed in all other different points and thematic that we are exchanging with other countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And now going really to some concrete cases, your department has also some actions being taken in Latin America. There is a regional office in Lima, Swiss ambassador from Peru, Honorary from his presence, Paul Garnier this afternoon. We have also a Peruvian ambassador in Switzerland here. They are both sitting together. This is very nice and shows great work being done together. But in Lima, indeed, there is a regional office, and sustainability, I think, is also important there.
It's difficult because I'm talking really under the control of my colleagues and friend, ambassador to Lima, and also under the control of the Peruvian ambassador here in Switzerland. Indeed, we have in Lima, we have a SDC hub with 3 regional programs. One is on water, the second one is on climate change, and the third one on disaster risk reduction. And in these 3 topics, we have specific projects. I do remember now some projects in water, how private company can better manage their water consumption. And we have a project in the clean air in big cities, namely the capitals of the 4 Pacific Islands country. We have a program on energy efficiency in buildings, and so forth. So they are very concrete programs, maybe not the biggest one worldwide, but they're concrete programs. And we work together with the Peruvian authorities. And there's Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, there are regional programs. And to get results, concrete results from, again, on pollution, air pollution in big cities, and energy efficiency and water management. So very concrete projects, the benefits of local population.
Yeah, I think this is very important indeed to be on the ground, and therefore to have some concrete actions. In Colombia also, Switzerland has been very active in many respects, and we have many programs in Colombia, and there is a peace plan. Yeah. Is there also something linked to the peace plan that would be fall under sustainability?
I would say that every project is linked to the peace and stability of the country. If you have a project on sustainable cities, on how the local authorities can better deliver services to the population, on building stronger institutions, they are maybe not very much linked with a ceasefire, but in the longer term, they are linked on the economic growth, on social stability, which, as we have heard before, I mean, it contributes to the stability of the country with very concrete projects.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me now turn back to Hervé, because SECO has important programs in Latin America, in Colombia and Peru, in 8 countries in the world. SECO has program in emerging economies in order to promote their development, going to the next level. And in that respect, what could you say on some of these programs which would have a sustainability accent?
Thank you, Philippe. So maybe just to set the scene, I think there is about 13 countries program of SECO all over the world, bilateral programs. At the same time, there is a slow shift from bilateral programs to more engagement with multilateral agency, with the IMF, with the World Bank Group, etc. It's not, by the way, it's not a tendency of Switzerland, it's a general tendency nowadays, but of course, these multilateral programs, they triple down in bilateral programs as well in Latin America. As you properly mentioned Colombia and Peru. Maybe when it comes to Colombia, SECO concentrates its engagement with regard to sustainable cities on supporting a strong regulatory framework and strengthening implementation capacity, and on strengthening planning and investment capacities of cities in sustainable urban development. A good example of that, of SECO, is a support in the field of sustainable cities, is the construction contribution to the Transmi-Cable in Bogota, which is a lift system implemented by the city of Bogota with the purpose of providing a complementary transportation service to Transmilenio. And by the way, I see that in slowly picking up in different cities in Latin America. I think in the north of Mexico, a number of places in the north of Mexico are as well provided now with lift and systems. We do skiing when we take this kind of transportation, but it proves very efficient, and it is an extremely good tool to avoid more CO2, of course. It is, in terms of sustainability, an excellent example of what you can, for example, do in terms of transportation and near city mobility, urban planification.
Thank you very much. Yourself, you spent a few years in Paris as the deputy head of the Swiss delegation of the OECD. You are a great knower of the OECD, and we know that Colombia and Costa Rica are members of the OECD, as well as Chile, and that Argentina, Brazil, and Peru are candidates. Now, the OECD is also putting a lot of effort on sustainability.
Absolutely right. And Mexico is, by the way, one of the first one. I think Chile was just after. Exactly. And no, but I think it's great. Now, it's great to see a great number of Latin American countries present in the OECD. I think for all the countries that are in, respectively for the ones that are candidates right now and in an active process of accession, the OECD is an extremely great tool for reform. Because the OECD is covering basically all political aspects except the culture, policy, and the policy of defense. So basically, with all the standards, you have over 200 committees in the OECD. You can really have leverage, to start. It is a tool. It is a tool for governments that are really willing to transform in their society. To say, well, basically, we want to be member of the OECD, and if we want to be member of the OECD, typical topics as corruption was mentioned before, the OECD is one of the mother place of the Anti-Corruption Convention, so you can really work. If that is delivering at the end, that's another question. But basically, what we used to say, it's not only about, signing these instruments, but it is about implementing and walk the talk, basically. And I think the OECD is of great help. And by the way, it's not only that process, but it gives excellent and brilliant comparative studies. So you can see best practices from one country to the other. And especially on sustainability, you have a committee on environment and subcommittee over all these issues. So I think it's a great tool. You don't have to convince me.
Okay, my last very quick question before we go to the audience for questions. Switzerland has concluded several free trade agreements across Latin America, and the policy has been very successful. Now, the business community is very interested to know the status of the agreement with Mercosur, and in that context, what is the importance of sustainable development and other issues in concluding finally the agreement?
So yeah, right. I think I'm going probably to state more or less the same that I did last year. And I remember that Alfredo had a question about agriculture reform in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. No, I mean, look, I think now is exactly the time where the political discussion has to take place. And that's going to be next week. So it's great that we have a mission, an economic mission, with over 35 undertakings from Switzerland, 10 officials. We have 5 people from the scientist community as well. Well, that's a big mission. Actually, that's the biggest mission ever in the last 5 years overseas, and I'm really happy that it is Brazil. We will have a side mission as well in Uruguay with the State Secretary. And it will be, of course, about Mercosur and the process of the agreement. That will be one part of the aspect. The other part of the aspect is going as well to promote our great infrastructure undertakings and all the undertakings Switzerland, companies in Switzerland that can provide services and goods for the infrastructure that was mentioned in the course of the discussion. Even, I think, by you saying one of the challenges of Latin America is having the right infrastructure for the years to come. So all in all, that's good. And coming back to the free trade agreement, I think you all know that there has been a long time discussion over the sustainable development standards and all the sustainability issue. And you all know here that let's say the EU has been quite pushy on the topic. There is a discussion about a side letter. I think the EFTA has to enter into that discussion next week at the political level and to see what is the substance before talking about any kind of instrument or chapter or wording. So what do we need? We will need something, and I have to make that point too, because as everybody know, a couple of years ago, we had a referendum for the free trade agreement with Indonesia, and it was won by a 51+1 or something like that percentage, which is not great. So at the time, you were going to have a discussion, a political discussion about the ratification in the agreement in the EFTA states and in Switzerland and in the parliament, and at the very end of the day, probably with a referendum. Because if you have Indonesia referendum, I bet we will probably have a referendum with Mercosur. So all here inside that are absolutely pro this free trade agreement are to be quite conscious that we have to make a solid case. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And indeed, in that context, we just heard that Mrs. von Leyen, the President of the European Commission, just said a couple of weeks ago that the EU wants to finish by the end of the year with Mercosur. So I think here now the way is getting open again, and certainly your mission with Federal Councillor Pamela comes at a very, very good timing, based also on what we have heard from the EU. And we very much look forward next year when we meet here again to have the news.
To have the conclusions, no? Of course.
And this being said, we're very happy to take some questions from the floor now.
I think that was an excellent discussion. Thank you very much. I have a question, Hervé. Tell us, what I don't understand is why does EFTA believe they have to wait for the European Union to sign their agreement? Isn't it possible for us to show the way?
So that's a great question. Look, the point is basically, it's the chronology. It's about the chronology. If the European Union is closing, and we closed before, and we are in our lengthy Swiss procedure of ratification in the Parliament, plus the lengthy procedure with the population for the referendum, by that time, people will see what is in the agreement with the European Union. If by any accident, the level of standards would not be either the same or better, we have a problem. Okay? So now the question is probably if the process with the European Union is now slowing or blocked to an extent that we might take a chance, we might ask ourselves if there is a window of opportunity. It is as simple as that, I guess. But the most complicated part is we need good standards. We need the substance, whether it is in a side letter, in a chapter, in a wording. You know I'm a lawyer, so the question will be, what is the substance? Because you need to make the political case at home. I mean, and by the way, I think it's not only the EFTA and Switzerland. I think, and I can understand that the Mercosur countries that are here, they also have to make a good case for the agreement. But and what I'm happy about is that this mission is hopefully going to help that there is a conversation at the political level, which is always good, you know. We had the pandemic, we had a slow start, now is a moment.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
By the way, next year I will say that I didn't remind what I've been saying today, but that's another story.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's always very interesting to hear you in the front, the part of the Swiss government, what it's doing in Latin America. My name is Rosario Muli, and about almost 10 years ago, we had here in Zurich a seminar in sustainability in Latin America. Mr. Nell was also participating in it.
I remember, yeah, I remember.
And in some way, I disagree. Sustainability is not a topic new in Latin America. It's a topic that has been of interest for long because we have a lack of utilities, water, energy. We always have to take care to save the utilities, to use them the best. But what I want to mention is, besides the fact that the Swiss government is having some activities in sustainability, or many activities, in that case, in the seminar, we had Swiss companies doing the examples of what they are doing. And we have, for example, Holcim providing building materials in some countries to improve the housing, and like this in a sustainable way, to reduce extra costs in warming conditions and so on. We also have Lind producing cacao in Ecuador, and not least, as you mentioned, Garaventa building the teleferics in Venezuela and in Mexico. And I think that's also an important part indirectly that how Switzerland is supporting the region in a sustainable way. That's all. I mean, was not a question, but I think was an important part to mention.
I think it's absolutely a valid point, and you give far better example than the ones that I gave, much more even concrete, and probably let me reformulate something that was probably not totally correct, and you noticed it. What we've noticed is in the discussion at the political level that slowly the focus of the discussion was slowly changing. That's a kind of discussion we did not have a couple of years ago. But that on the continent, that the people themselves, that the civil society, that NGOs and even companies were already slowly, you know, gaining traction on the subject. That absolutely right.
Thank you, Hervé. Now, I would like to comment that Mercosur countries are doing big efforts in sustainability matters. In the case of Uruguay, we have 97% of the electric grid with renewable sources. We have 44 wind parks plus photovoltaic source and hydraulic. And we're also investing in green hydrogen. And so is Brazil and Argentina. They are working on projects for green hydrogen. We have committed by 2050 to have zero carbon dioxide emissions. So Mercosur countries, sustainability is a topic that is in the agenda. Regarding the negotiations between Mercosur and European Union, now on July we are going to have in Brussels the summit of CELAC countries with European Union countries. Brazil is now holding the presidency of Mercosur countries, and Spain is holding the presidency of European Union. So probably there will be parallel meetings between the two blocks to unblock the Mercosur agreement. But this is complicated because EU, it's 27 countries. And you remember that before the negotiations were taken place under the principle of single undertaking. That means that everything has to be agreed to reach an agreement. Now the negotiations so they're getting complicated. The principle is of splitting. So the countries will have the flexibility to split the different chapters of the EU-Mercosur agreement so as to make reservations on each chapter or not. So I don't know if it's going to be very successful, but this summit in July is going to be important to see if we get a boost in the Mercosur European Union agreements. Said that, it's much more easier for EFTA and Mercosur countries that we are four on each side to reach a more quicker agreement. And maybe it's the time, as Linda said here, and today I had a talk with one of the foreign ministers of EFTA country, that maybe EFTA should show the way and by itself advance in the negotiations to sign sooner than EU, or at least to advance much quicker to the EU and be ready to sign and to close the agreement in the near future. So maybe in your mission now to Brazil and Uruguay, you could see what is the idea in Mercosur countries so as to advance in signing the agreement with EFTA.
I couldn't more agree.
Yes, so do I. I think it's very important. It's very good to see what Uruguay is doing and also the perspectives. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
My name is Renata. I work with financing for Latin American markets at Credit Suisse. And I have a more practical and technical question to Hervé regarding, I'm interested in understanding more how the sustainability component is assessed when you are analyzing projects. Is, for example, if it's a sustainable financing, for example, for a renewable energy project in Latin America or where else, is that would that get more favorable conditions, or would that be prioritized in any way compared to maybe like a transaction that doesn't have a sustainability angle?
So, thank you for the question, which is indeed a technical one. I think I'm going to walk a little bit on thin ice here because I'm not a sustainability specialist and I'm not drafting, the rules when it comes into sustainability chapter of the agreements. But I've seen a couple of these chapters before in my previous jobs a couple of years ago. So it did evolve meanwhile. And generally speaking, it's about putting framework conditions on both sides of the states. It doesn't go down to the shaping of a project. But what you're saying was triggering to me is, of course, when SECO is doing economic cooperation project, we were mentioning Colombia and Peru, you look, of course, at these kinds of aspects, including the way the financialization is done. That's the best answer I'm afraid I can give you for the time being, but happy to direct you to someone that can give you a proper and precise answer.
Yes. Well.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I wanted to really congratulate the organizers and you for bringing the sustainability topic to the stage so much. I work in sustainability. I am a consultant in sustainability, and I work with projects for companies here in Switzerland, in Europe, and also in Brazil. And both are trying to do their best. There are differences in culture and all. But most recently, I've been facing a question because of some of the requests we receive. So while the North Hemisphere tighten regulations and agreements about and targets around sustainability, what kind of industries, how the regulations are being put and the targets for net zero, I am curious because I've seen some movements of companies trying to bring them the headquarters or their activities to the South Hemisphere, even asking for support on that and to getting financial aid for that. I wonder if there is in your negotiations, either in the format of law, regulation, or agreements, any safeguard so that we avoid the migration of dirt industries to the South Hemisphere, especially considering that aspect that there are a lot of Swiss investors in those companies. Are there any safeguards? Do you see any chance to have them? Any comment around the topic? I know it's a complex one, so any insights from that side?
Yes, well, I think it's broader than the question of market access and free trade, you know. It is about, generally speaking, of the, you know how we operate in Switzerland now. I mean, the state is here to put framework, we call them always framework conditions. You have a flexible market, you have et cetera, et cetera. That's what the state does. Switzerland does not make, we always make that point, strong industry policy. If you look in detail, there are some aspects, but generally speaking, the doctrine is no, it's a liberal doctrine, it's no industry policy. We are not France, sorry. Ambassador of France is not in the room, so I can say that. The point is, when you have such an approach, and you look at regulation issues, and your issue is a regulation issue, what you bring to the discussion, then you have to say, okay, if I don't have binding regulation, I have probably to look at soft law. And in the room of soft law, and there we are back to the OECD has a number of soft law standards when it comes exactly to these questions. And they're reflected, for example, in guiding principle of Economie Suisse, for example, of different economic association in Switzerland as to how undertakings have to behave. And that's the background. So, and I think your point is basically, that's what we think is best, because we think the responsibility lies within the actor, the entrepreneur, because he's taking the investment risk. Now, of course, there is a pressure of I would say, not only social media, but in the public, there is more conscious about. The more you have a discussion about sustainability, the more these topics are coming, and the more you see differences in parliaments and at the political level. But that's the ongoing discussion. So there is no binding regulation as such, but there is a discussion about that. Typically, when you look at Latin America, one of the aspects that is very important for Switzerland is commodities, and especially gold. Gold is a great part of the goods that are imported in Switzerland. And when you look at gold, you have to think about, okay, is the gold that is coming in Switzerland coming from a proper extraction mode that is respecting sustainability. And there you have all this soft law discussion, and then you have more a dialogue with the companies and with the NGOs on both sides, trying to mitigate this kind of risk. But you don't have strong regulation as such, at least that's my opinion, but I'm ready to take any counterpoint on this.
And I would just say, for your objective to be met, first, the country which receives, like Brazil, would have in each legislation to have certain
exactly at the end of the day.
Right. And second, in our free trade agreements, we usually never had anybody to have to change domestic laws, Swiss laws or from partners. Now, the ambassador from Chile has asked for the floor.
Just adding one point before my question. I think it's important to consider also the multilateral efforts are going on this issue and the negotiation of a treaty of human rights and business. And that is something that maybe will give some lights on that. I have one question and probably one comment. One question is innovation. You said that we have commodities, we want to export, but sometimes we have the lack of innovation that Switzerland has. You are ranked as the first most innovative country in the world, and that's, I think, innovation is an important key issue for sustainability.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's important. Where do you see the cooperation between Latin America and Switzerland in order to get that innovation into Latin American countries? And the second question, I've heard a lot of sustainability. For Chile, it's very important, the sustainability, and we're working very hard on that, especially in high seas, protection of the high seas. And in that sense, we've done a lot of efforts in the multilateral area to gain that protection areas. But also in the internal market, we have lithium, as you said, and we had just launched a national plan on lithium in order to foreign companies to go invest in Chile on that sense. And the other issue, it's electromobility. I think it's an important key issue. We currently, in Santiago, almost 100% of the public transport is electromobility basis. So, and in that sense, important partnerships with Switzerland could be important. And green hydrogen. You talk about Brazil in that sense. We just received the European Union President Commission visit. She just created a fund for Chile for 200 million in order to invest in hydrogen. We feel the lack of sometimes Swiss investors or business community that are interested in that. I've been going around and I see more light in Germany, in European Union, rather than in Switzerland. And that is something that worries me as an ambassador here. That's the question. And the question, that's the comment, and the question is about innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, first of all, when it comes to more investment, I think you made the point that the latest Swiss Business Hub was opened in Santiago. I think that's a good sign, but in itself, that doesn't mean that the investors are coming, but it's an encouraging sign, I think, and an expression of interest, I would say, from the state and para-state level, and we are happy that they didn't hit the electrical. No, but your point was innovation. So I think when it comes to innovation, the thing is, I would seek the dialogue as well with the State Secretary for Education, Innovation, etc. in Switzerland. I think, and I'm sure that in your capacity, you're as well having that kind of dialogue with universities and the two polytechnical schools in Switzerland. And they're always interested if there are points of contacts with other institutions to enter into a dialogue. That is certainly one of the aspects. The other aspect, you mentioned it's more investment. And I think that goes back to your presentation and the risk factors and the assessment of that risk factors. In my experience, what the OECD till now never could achieve is that we have a very solid committee nowadays that we should have on public affairs in the sense of public policies and rules and law. And if you have a strong situation that undertakings are interested in investing as well. I'm not saying that's not the case, but it's probably as well an issue of the perception and the risk.
If I may very quickly, Ambassador, many thank you for the question. Hervé said it, we don't have any industrial policy. If you want Swiss investments to go to Chile, it's your responsibility. I'm sorry to be very blunt.
He's blunter than me, huh?
But it's your responsibility. I mean, if you want innovation, it's your responsibility. You have to attract our talent from the academy or from private sector. I mean, we can help you with some addresses, with I don't know what, but it's your responsibility, not mine. To be very blunt, huh? But we are ready. We're ready to do it.
Yes, last question now with Simone Wyss-Fedele.
I mean, we always say it's a Team Switzerland approach, right? So I would say I think it's a collaboration. So I agree, right? You need to have good framework conditions, but Chile is a country which is of increasing interest to Swiss companies. And I think we were very happy to work together. I think one thing is that if you can attract Swiss companies in the area of green energy, it's what you have highlighted, Hervé. Swiss companies engage very much in technology transfer with local partners. So I think that's a key element which pushes the capability of innovation quite fast. And then I think we are very happy to chat on opportunities locally and to see how we can push it out to Swiss SMEs. So this is just adding an additional layer. We have different roles, but I just wanted to give a hint. So no question.
Thank you.
Sorry, but it was very interesting listening.
Thank you. Okay, now we will have to conclude, and indeed there is some technology transfer going on to Chile, but it takes time. Aqua 4D, Swiss company, as a subsidiary there now, and it's not only because I'm pushing down my bottle of water, but it's about water, precisely about water, to save water. I saved some water too by catching it back quickly. But it takes time. Each process takes time. There is potential, and Chile is a country which certainly meets all the conditions to have such a transfer taking place. Now we're going to conclude. Maybe perhaps a last sentence on your side.
Thank you, Philippe. If I may, I would like to quote Mario Vargas Llosa, one of my favorite writers. And he said that if Latin America continues on the path of democracy, and if Latin America preserves its combat against corruption and its integration to the world economy, it will cease to be the continent of the future, and it will be the continent of the present. Switzerland is more than ready, private sector, the public sector, more than ready to accompany Latin America in this path of democracy. We think that Latin America, with Europe or North America and some Asian countries, we are the democracy, and we have to be stronger than other countries that are not democracies. But, and my second quote, and I quote Mr. Häfliger, you have to deliver. Again, it's your responsibility to integrate into the economic world if you want so. It's your responsibility, with the help of other countries, to continue on the path of democracy, and it's your responsibility, with the help of other countries among Switzerland, to combat against corruption. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And you, Hervé, your last sentence of the day to our audience?
Yeah, right. You just caught me on the wrong foot. No, I don't. It was a very interesting discussion. I take a number of active points, including very practical examples. I think it's going to be that subject is going to be an even more intensive subject for the next decade and 20 years. That's definitely on the agenda. That's not anymore from the table to be wished away. And I think that you mentioned it at some point, Mirko, the strategy, the foreign economic strategy of Switzerland is mentioning next to digitalization, sustainability, and I think that's there for a long time.
Okay, thank you very much. Now you have a coffee break on the agenda.
Merci.